Increasing flexibility, eliminating redundancy, forming collaborative supply chain relationships, and improving supply chain agility are some of the essentials for a strong, innovative industrial base. Innovative manufacturers with unique value are critical to the strength of the nation's industrial base. Today's featured speaker will share the latest strategies and programs to strengthen the defense-wide industrial base. She is currently the Director of Manufacturing, Resiliency and Assurance, and International Manufacturing and Innovation within the Office of the Deputy Assistant Secretary of the Defense for Manufacturing and Industrial Base Policy. During her tenure in OSD, she has focused on building strong interagency partnerships to address broad transition of manufacturing issues, such as manufacturing readiness and the advanced manufacturing enterprise. Her current position uses the broad authorities of the Industrial Base Analysis and Sustainment Program element to enable a modern industrial base that integrates traditional and emerging sectors to be able to respond at will to national security requirements. Most recently, as the director of the DoD Manufacturing Technology Program, she led the effort in establishing the DoD's National Manufacturing Innovation Institutes outlined in the President's 2013 State of the Union Address, now known as Manufacturing USA Institutes. Without further ado, I'd like to welcome Ms. Adele Ratcliffe to the stage.
Wow, good afternoon. It is good to be here with you today. Can you guys hear me in the back? Because I've got two mics because people say I talk low and slow, so I want to make sure I'm mic'd up well. So you can hear me in the back. Excellent. Yes, I am Adele Ratcliffe from the Department of Defense. I am in the Office of Manufacturing and Industrial Base Policy. Our office monitors the health and well-being of the defense industrial base, and where concerned, the broader U.S. industrial base, especially cross-cutting sectors that have significant impact on our ability to marshal our forces and move forward for national security. I tend to walk around, so I'll try to not upset the cameras when I do this. On the eve of World War II in 1939, General George Patton was about to take command of the 2nd Armored Brigade at Fort Benning, Georgia. Under his command, he inherited 325 World War I vintage tanks. At the same time that the Germans possessed 2,000 Panzers, hardly technology overmatch. Exiting World War I, our policies at the national level and the budgets within the department at the time attrited our core competencies within our defense industrial base. We had 0-day supply of black powder. Our machine guns were World War I vintage packed in grease. We only had about 1,700 planes in our inventory. The readiness of our military had plummeted. We had gone from the 4th largest military in the world in World War I to 18th in the world on the eve of World War II, right in front of Holland. When Patton ran his war games, he had about 50,000 troops during those war games. 2/3 of those were National Guardsmen. And we had to use good humor ice cream trucks as targets. Things were so poor in terms of readiness within the military that, as well as our systems, that Patton had to use his own money to go down to the Sears and Roebuck store to buy nuts and bolts to maintain his tanks. The National Defense Strategy has been recently published, and if you look at the opening remark of our secretary, he talks about the fact that we're emerging from strategic atrophy, and we find ourselves in an eroded condition of readiness, our competitive advantage challenged in today's environment. The conditions that we face today are not unlike what we saw on the eve of World War II. As Secretary Mattis put it in testimony, and I'll read it to make sure that I don't misquote him, "No enemy has done more harm to the readiness of our U.S. military than the combined impact of Budget Control Act, defense spending cuts, and continuing resolutions for 9 out of the past 10 years. And if that corrosiveness has undermined our military readiness, it's had an equal impact on you, our U.S. industrial base, and your readiness, both for economic prosperity as well as national security. A think tank, CSIS, recently published a report that documented more than 17,000 members of you exited our supply chain between 2011 and 2015. Roughly 20% of our small and medium manufacturers exited during that time. On the broader scale of manufacturing that's been well documented over the past several years, we lost more than 5 million manufacturing jobs between 2000 and 2010. Today, our adversaries use our industrial base as their chessboard, the cornerstone of our military and economic might. They have bought, sold, stymied, and stolen where needed our technology. At the same time that they've launched during our lull of strategic atrophy, they've moved forward on their industrial policies. You guys are well aware that China has announced Made in China 2025 with the goal of advancing technology and supplanting the U.S. in emerging technologies. Our world and its uncertainties demand a more lethal, resilient, and rapidly innovating joint force, according to the National Defense Strategy, with a robust constellation of allies. When we look at you, our industrial base, and by extension our defense industrial base, must have the same strength, grit, and force posture to match that of our military. A partner in the constellation of our allies, with a force posture that can respond at will to national security needs. Technology overmatch is not when we possess one in a lab somewhere, but when we can produce at volume, over and over and over when needed, whether that's for commercial requirements, for a commercial aircraft, or whether it's for national security purposes. We can look back at World War II as a good example of that, right? Britain had some cutting-edge technology back in that day, radars and next-generation engines. But because they had not used design for manufacturing and high-volume manufacturing with repeatable end games, they literally had to box that stuff up on a crate, put it on a boat, push it across the Atlantic through the infested waters of German submarines, and bring it to the United States and ask you, our industrial base, if you could make it. And you responded. If we look at the framework of the National Defense Strategy and contrast that framework for where we need to go from a military perspective, I think it offers a good framework for how we consider how to increase the readiness of our U.S. industrial base as we exit atrophy. We've done a lot to modernize our industrial base over the past 8 years, but there's more to come. If we look at Secretary Mattis's first priority, it is to build a more lethal force. He wants to modernize, evolve operations and organize, develop an agile way to deploy ourselves, and cultivate talent. The second priority is to strengthen the partnerships with our allies and attract new partners. And the last thing that we need to do as a department in terms of its top 3 is to reform our practices. I think when we look at what we do in our business, and many of the things that we talked about in the National Manufacturing Strategy and the things that we've talked about offline walking through the shop floor today in the hall, those 3 priorities offer a same framework for how we can maybe consider readiness and resiliency and innovation in our manufacturing and industrial base aspect. When it comes to a modern industrial base, the department needs both traditional sectors, those like munitions and missiles, right? We've seen a corrosive effect in the budget on those sectors, but we also have emerging sectors, many of those that we see around here. We talk about 3D printing. We launched the Manufacturing USA Institutes, one of which was targeted on that to help grow and catalyze that, that technology, but there's more work to be done there. So we need to fortify our traditional sectors and forge and fortify our new ones. Within the Office of Manufacturing and Industrial Base Policy, we have 3 investment programs that we use to help forge and fortify. One of which is the Manufacturing Technology Program that I used to lead, but we spearheaded the institutes underneath. Title III that many of you are familiar with in terms of being able to go in and work with heavy industries and large money to capitalize where it's beyond the risk of industry. And we also have a third program that I now run, Industrial Base Analysis and Sustainment Program, IBAS. I like to call it the big fish. Underneath IBAS, we have 4 authorities. One is to monitor and assess, sustain and expand our industrial base, address urgent operational needs, and mitigate supply chain vulnerabilities. I can drive a big truck through that, a big satellite, a big ship through those 4 authorities, and I aim to do that. Within those 3 investment programs, that gives us what I call a full spectrum of authorities and a full spectrum of investment opportunities against those authorities. So if you're sitting out there and you've got industrial-based challenges, Melinda Woods heads up Title III. She's about $30 million annually, non-expiring funds. DMS&T and Mantech at the aggregate level within the services are around $300 million a year. And then IBAS is the new program that I've got that I'm growing those requirements around. So when it comes to resiliency and innovation, if we want to use that framework that I talked about earlier, there are 2 sectors that I've been specifically concerned about that we've partnered with industry on a number of listening sessions to understand the state of play and what do we need to do to position ourselves for tomorrow. One of which is cybersecurity for manufacturing. Raise your hand if you're from a small company in manufacturing. Raise your hand if you're from any manufacturing company. Excellent. I don't know, how many of you are familiar with Visual Capitalist? You guys, anybody use their stuff? You use them? I use them. I like them. Infographics. So I'm referencing an infographic on them. We've done a number of reports, and Foresight's done one. Our National Defense Industry Association has done a study on the how prepared are we to, in terms of cybersecurity for manufacturing within our supply chain. Visual Capitalist says that there's about 20 billion devices that will be IT connected by 2020. In 2017, we saw as many records stolen in the first half of the year that we saw all of the year in 2013. The FBI estimates that more than $450 billion worth of information alone was stolen in the United States. And expectations are within 2020 that we'll see $1 trillion worth of information stolen through cybersecurity attacks. I'm going to use analog polling. 99% of the small and medium manufacturers in this country are, here's your choice, 2,000 people. How many of you guys think that there are 2,000 or more employees in medium manufacturers in this country? 1. About 1,000 in those companies. How many people think that 99% of the small and medium manufacturers have about 1,000 employees? Less than 500. Correct answer is less than 500. 99, NIST says, Department of Commerce survey says that 99% of the small and medium manufacturers in the United States are less than 500 employees. 80% of those are less than 20 employees. Think about that. 50% of the cybersecurity attacks on our industrial base come from nation-state actors. This should concern you. We ask small and medium companies of 20 people to guard themselves against coordinated attack on the industrial base. And you're not insulated from that if you're a large company. I just was walking the floor. I was talking to someone yesterday at the strategy that talked about their ability to weather an attack recently from 2 nation-state actors with one of our other interagency partners helping them on that. constant coordinated attack on our industrial base. 80% of the Fortune 500 value of companies is in intellectual property. If you are a small and medium manufacturer or a manufacturer of any size, you are a major target for cybersecurity attacks. And the unique vulnerability of those cyber physical systems that sit on the shop floor are one of that are a concern for myself and my interagency partners at Department of Energy, NIST, and others that we're working with. So to respond to that, we're formalizing ourselves to help understand what we need to do to develop an orchestrated strategy at the interagency level that includes industry in that strategy on how to protect and respond to that. Obviously, the first line of defense is the small companies, but we can't rely solely upon those. We must have a more resilient approach to how to protect ourselves on that. So we've all agreed that one of the first things is to raise awareness on that and include that in our talking points, of which I'm doing here today. But to get at that, as we were talking offline this morning, part of the ability of the Department of Defense in our manufacturing industrial base is to be able to have an orchestrated policy on the digital twin. All that is tied together with our IT connected systems, the digital twin, and cybersecurity on that. So the department needs to move forward in wrestling with how we're going to manage intellectual property in that digital domain. And even possibly use things like cryptocurrency, right, and blockchain for how we're going to do that. Another sector that that we have been out listening to the U.S. industrial base on is the machine tool sector. I know many of you sit in that sector, right? We've partnered with AMT on several listening sessions, one in Atlanta, one in Cincinnati, and then I partnered with NSF and UNC Charlotte to host a workshop recently in DC on the state of the machine tool sector. That sector is equally concerning in terms of core competencies, right? The average machine tool age in this country now is somewhere around 15 years old. We've seen a lack of demand in terms of capitalizing on the shop floor across the United States, which has really attrited U.S.-held companies in this country. I mean, I go and talk to companies on all across the U.S. and there's like, hey, this system was bought decades ago and I don't even have anyone here that can maintain it. We're now having to maintain it. The company's vacated the market long ago, decades ago, and now it's so old that I'm not even certain if my next generation workforce will know how to maintain this machine tool, right? At the same time that our industrial-based machine tool sector is attrited, China's has been growing. They're number one, both in consumption and production. We're number 4. Last year, they procured $20 billion worth of machine tools, while the United States industrial base procured $4 billion. They outpace us by $5 billion in 1 year alone. The IR&D investments made in the U.S. machine tool sector is a pennies on the dollar because of the demand signals have just not been there for that sector to be able to innovate. Many of the subcomponents have zero capability in the U.S. industrial base. When you look at the source of those machine tools, they've lowered the barriers to entry in those countries to encourage the machine tool sector to move there, gain the competencies, and then created bully tactics to push them out. And in the process of that, along with the lack of demand signals and reinvestment in this country, we see an attrition on the machine tool sector. So at that interagency level, we're wrestling with, is a machine tool sector a core competency of a vibrant industrial base? And if it is the U.S. machine tool rightly positioned to be able to compete today and tomorrow in the global environment? And if it's not, what should it be? What is the role of government in that? Do we need a public-private partnership in the machine tool sector like we've done on the emerging technologies that we've launched underneath Manufacturing USA? Or should we leave it to its own direction and allow that to progress and likely attrit itself to a point of little or no return? I happen to think that a vibrant and competitive industrial base needs a strong, vibrant machine tool, and so that we're working to launch an initiative in partnership with DOE, anchoring ourselves around several of their labs as a hub to catalyze and help advance the state of that machine tool sector. When we look at the parallels of cultivate talent, we all are aware of the challenges that we face on STEM initiatives, right? And those exist far in the trades as you live and breathe every day as well. Between 1988 and 2012, the United States lost 37% of its welding community. And 1/3 of the manufacturers, even in low times, say they have chronic shortages of STEM. We've got to begin to get at these issues a little bit differently. So to begin to address that underneath ABAS, in partnership with NASA and John Vickers down in Huntsville, we've launched the Manufacturing Skills Challenge to help elevate the prestige of manufacturing. There's nothing like, in my opinion, I grew up in the South where, man, we would stab you with the fork just to get the last piece of chicken on the dinner table, right? I mean, we'll compete over tiddlywinks. If you tell a kid, nope, you cannot keep score, we will keep score, we will win, right? So let's elevate the prestige of manufacturing through a national level competition, right? Exercise our supply chain and critical competencies like machining or composites or welding. Do for manufacturing what Dean Kamen and First Robotics has done for growing talent in the engineering field, right? Working with Oak Ridge, I was up talking to those kids at Oak Ridge National Lab. In exposure to First Robotics, those kids in 2 years changed the course of what they wanted to do. 5 of the 7 seniors were not going into any math-based program in college. Within 2 years of First Robotics, those 5 were all going to engineering schools and picking their engineering schools based upon their exposure to First Robotics and what those schools had to offer in manufacturing. We can do that shift change in this country as well if we create the right environment. And I aim to do that in partnership with NASA, piloting that Manufacturing Skills Challenge in the South. Also, in building partnerships and attracting new entrants into our market, we need to care and feed for emerging technologies, hardware-based technologies, those that are manufacturing-based, those that are hardware-based. You guys know the venture capital community is largely investing in software. That is not in our best interest. We need long-term sustained investment in the hardware-based technologies and those that are investing in innovating in the cutting-edge manufacturing processes. So to kind of get at this problem, I've partnered with folks that are in the arena of the private investment community, I'll call it that. Not just VCs, not just private equity, but private citizens that also want to invest in hardware technology. And we've launched through, in partnership with the Air Force, a framework to attract young entrants into hardware-based technologies, provide them access to mentorship from the venture capital community to help them be better businesses, provide them access to tech partners that will advise them without trying to rob them of their IP on engineering, and provide them access to low-rate production so that they don't have to worry about how to invest in capitalizing their floor when they're not really positioned to go do that. At the conclusion of that effort, they'll be infused with funding from the investors to help continue their growth down the pipeline. We have to begin to act in our own interest. Others are investing in our country and through that investment are siphoning off the best of our technology overseas. We've got to begin to get at investing in ourselves again in this country, and that's what the framework of Elevate is targeted at doing. And lastly, on reform. The budget, as you know, is increasing in the department, but if we can't get the money to you in a timely manner, it doesn't really matter. So I say contracting crushes. I mean, how many people have waited through a contracting activity to get the money that they needed to go move forward? One? We only have one person have that problem? Yeah. I think contracting crushes us. I mean, our contracting officers, our grievance officers are being crushed with the volume of money and the requirements. Beautiful thing that Mike Griffin just said, if you've heard him, he is our new R&E coming into the department. He says that he aims to start with the minimum legal requirements, right? Instead of piling on everything and then trying to get it off. To respond to the pipeline of funding that to be able to invest and modernize our industrial base, I've moved forward on launching an OT, a broad other transaction called Cornerstone. You are the bedrock of our economic and military might. You underpin every element of DIME, diplomat, information, military, and economic opportunities that we have in this country. We need to be able to access you and communicate with you and collaborate with you in a framework that makes it easier for us to do that. Cornerstone is that. It's 16 sectors. So if you Google Cornerstone OTA, you can find out more information about it. It's got a long URL because the Army established it for me, so we haven't been able to get the tiny URL yet. So if you Google Cornerstone OTA out of ECBC, there's more information there. It's a consortium of consortiums. We've kind of learned our lesson on the Manufacturing USA's. We weren't able to establish a common IP framework. It's a no-cost membership to join that OT. It allows us to be able to communicate with you directly, and even if I need to go direct to your company and do business with you without much more than saying I need to do business with you. The day I need to marshal an industrial base consortium underneath that, I also have the latitude to be able to do that in areas like optics, as an example, that we're looking at taking on. Cornerstone OTA. I think this will provide us a unique ability within the department to be able to collaborate with industry, whether it's our Advanced Manufacturing USA Institutes and be able to pull those technology spaces together and do a joint project underneath there, or be able to work with a company that has a shared interest between submarines and, say, aircraft, that otherwise it makes it really difficult to get at when you have a common issue like machining on those problems, right? So that Cornerstone OTA is a way to rapidly get at industry with little more than a discussion that we're having here today. How am I doing on time, Debbie? Right up. So as I conclude and hopefully have a few moments for questions, looking back at World War II as an example of why we need our strong, healthy, resilient industrial base, why you need to be as lethal as our warfighter. Admiral Yamamoto, when asked by his prime minister about attacking the United States, said this. He had spent 7 years with our military and most of that time embedded in the U.S. industrial base, just walking around, seeing the shop floors, understanding your capacity, your core competencies of engineering and manufacturing. So when asked by his prime minister about what Japan should do, he said, "They have great spirit," I'm paraphrasing, of course. And I got this out of a National Geographic article last year that included history on World War II, including a pull sheet on him for reference. But he said, I've been there. They're of great spirit. I interpreted that as innovative, with great capacity and capability. In other words, we had the competencies that we needed with the capacities here. We didn't have to look to anyone, including our natural resources and raw materials. He said, if you cannot vanquish them, you must not attack them. If you cannot vanquish them, you must not attack them. As we look forward in terms of our economic and national security, we need an industrial base that has the same peak performance as our military, that makes our enemies sweat, provides comfort to our allies, and causes those that haven't picked a side to pause. An industrial base of this capacity not only allows our military to navigate freely in the world to carry our interests forward, the ability to defeat our enemies, because at the end of the day, it's not about the ability to, people don't sweat one, right? It's the ability of you, our industrial base. If they take out one, you just marshal another one and send it right over, right? And it goes on and on and on. The relentless pursuit of being able to make things when required to is what causes people to pause. But this not only allows our national security, it allows our people just like you allow our military to push back on intense forces that seek to undermine our democratic principles of liberty here and abroad. But your strong manufacturing resilience also allows our people, our citizens, to push back on intense pressures that seek to undermine their hope, as well as other citizens around the world. I want to thank you for your contributions to our national security. Appreciate the time to be here today to talk to you about your role in our national security. And if I have time for a few questions, I'll take those from the audience using the analog, because I don't have that screen right here. So any questions, any comments? Come on, one. I'll conclude with this then. On the eve of World War I talked about the state of affairs. At the conclusion of World War II, at the eve of World War II, I talked about the conditions. On the conclusion of World War II, our industrial base, because of the core competencies that were contained in the United States industrial base, we were able to pivot. You produced hundreds of thousands of vehicles, hundreds of millions of machine guns, billions of rounds of ammo, and 9,000 naval ships when yards weren't even built. The shipyards were not even built that the 9,000 ships were ultimately built in. And you moved from having the inability to make things to fully making things not only for the United States, but for all of our allies during that war. The question today is, for us, for economic prosperity and national security, what are the core competencies that need to exist in our U.S. industrial base? Where are we on that path, and where do we need to go for today and tomorrow? Thank you for your time, and thank you, Jeff, for allowing me to be here.